The jungle of the Papua New Guinea highlands is not a place that gives up its secrets easily. It is a vertical world of emerald green, where the canopy is so thick that the forest floor exists in a state of perpetual, humid twilight. In July 1978, a team of Australian mineral surveyors was cutting a path through a particularly remote sector of the Owen Stanley Range, a region so rugged that even the local tribes avoided it. They weren't looking for history, they were looking for copper. The team lead, a veteran bushman named Miller, was the first to see it. At first, he thought it was a strangely shaped rock formation draped in strangler figs and moss. But as he swung his machete to clear the vines, the blade didn't strike stone or wood. It struck metal with a dull, hollow clink. Miller stepped back, wiping the sweat and grit from his eyes. Shoving aside a heavy curtain of ferns, he found himself staring into the snarling, painted teeth of a shark. It was the iconic nose art of a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, the rugged workhorse of the Pacific Theater. But this wasn't a charred wreck or a scattered debris field. The aircraft was sitting level, its landing gear retracted as if it had performed a perfect belly landing on a bed of soft ferns decades ago. The jungle had tried to swallow it, but the aluminum skin was remarkably intact, protected from the worst of the corrosion by the thick canopy. The propellers were bent back, not shattered, indicating the engine had been idling or off when it touched down. As the rest of the survey team gathered, a heavy silence fell over the group. There were no bullet holes in the fuselage. No signs of fire. The cockpit canopy was closed, but not locked. "Look at the markings," one of the surveyors whispered. The white star of the U.S. Army Air Forces was still visible under a layer of green lichen. It was a time capsule from 1944, or so they thought. But as Miller climbed onto the wing and peered through the grime-streaked glass of the cockpit, the mystery shifted from a simple wartime crash to something far more haunting. The seat was empty. There were no remains. But resting on the dashboard, held in place by a rusted clip, was a flight logbook. And resting in the cup holder was a silver thermos, its lid screwed tight, looking as though it had been placed there only minutes before. They had found a ghost. But as they would soon discover, the ghost hadn't disappeared in the heat of World War II. It had, according to the records inside, been flying a war that had ended 7 years before its last engine shut down. Miller's fingers trembled as he reached into the cockpit to retrieve the flight log. The air inside the cabin was trapped, smelling of stale ozone, hydraulic fluid, and old leather, a scent that had been sealed tight since the canopy was last slid shut. The logbook itself was a standard-issue military ledger, its cover stiffened by the jungle's humidity but remarkably preserved. As the survey team huddled under the dim green light of the canopy, Miller flipped past the early entries. They were routine: 1,943 patrols out of Port Moresby, 1944 escort missions over the Bismarck Sea. The handwriting was neat, a disciplined cursive belonging to a second lieutenant named William "Billy" Graves. Then, the timeline broke. Most wartime logs end with a missing in action stamp or a final, frantic scrawl during a mechanical failure. But Graves' logbook continued past August 1945. It continued past the surrender on the USS Missouri. It continued past the decommissioning of the very squadron painted on the P-40's tail. "Look at the dates," Miller muttered, his voice dropping to a whisper. The entries became sporadic, written in a different, more hurried hand. There were logs for 1947, 1949, and 1950. The missions weren't military. They were descriptions of the terrain below. Jungle still shifting. The peaks don't match the charts. Fuel low, but the engine hums like it's brand new. The final entry was dated November 14, 1952. 7 years after the world had moved on from the Great War, Lieutenant Graves had supposedly been circling the Owen Stanley Range in a fighter that should have been scrapped metal years prior. The last lines were not a cry for help, but a calm observation. "The clearing is perfect. Visibility 10 miles. Switching off now to listen to the birds. I don't think I'll be heading back to the coast today. The coffee is still hot." The survey team looked from the logbook to the cockpit. The silver thermos was still there. The leather seat showed the indentation of a pilot who had just stepped out for a moment. But there were no footprints in the soft, mossy earth around the plane. No trail through the ferns. According to every military record in Washington, D.C., Lieutenant William Graves had been declared dead in 1944 after his plane disappeared during a routine scouting mission. Yet, here was his aircraft, sitting in a clearing that didn't exist on any 1940s map, with a logbook claiming he had lived, flown, and maintained this machine for nearly a decade in total isolation. Was it a hallucination of a dying man? Or had the P-40 flown into a pocket of the Pacific where time itself had stalled, allowing a pilot from 1944 to land in a 1952 that never happened? The survey team stood in a trance-like silence, the humid jungle air pressing in on them. Miller reached into the cockpit, his hand hovering for a second before he grasped the silver thermos. It was a standard-issue military vacuum flask, the kind carried by thousands of pilots during the war, but it felt impossibly heavy. It didn't rattle. It didn't feel like an empty, rusted husk. As he slowly unscrewed the cap, a faint, ghostly hiss of pressure escaped, the sound of a seal being broken for the first time in decades. Then came the smell. It wasn't the stench of rot or the metallic tang of stagnant water. It was the rich, unmistakable aroma of black coffee, bitter and strong, as if it had been brewed that morning in a farmhouse kitchen. It's still liquid," Miller whispered, peering inside. The interior of the cockpit was a museum of the mundane, preserved with a precision that defied the laws of tropical decay. In the Pacific, the jungle usually claims a machine within months. The humidity rots the rubber, the insects eat the seat cushions, and the vines crush the instruments. But here, the leather of the pilot's seat was supple, the Bakelite knobs on the radio were uncracked, and the plexiglass canopy was as clear as a fresh mountain stream. On the floorboards lay a crumpled pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, a single matchstick resting on top. Everything suggested that Lieutenant Graves hadn't vanished in a violent crash or a desperate struggle. He had simply stepped out. "Check the clock," one of the surveyors said, pointing to the dashboard instrument. The mechanical hands were frozen at 11:14. Miller checked his own modern digital watch. It was 11:10 a.m. A cold shiver, unrelated to the jungle heat, ran down his spine. The most disturbing detail wasn't what was missing, but what was present. Beside the thermos sat a small, leather-bound photograph tucked into the edge of the instrument panel. It was a picture of a young woman in a floral dress, smiling on a porch in Ohio. On the back, in the same neat cursive found in the early parts of the logbook, was written, "Wait for me, Evelyn. 1944. The photo wasn't yellowed. It wasn't curled at the edges. It looked as though it had been printed yesterday. The surveyors began to back away from the plane. In the world of aviation forensics, a preserved cockpit usually implies a sudden, catastrophic event that seals the environment. But there was no fire here, no trauma. The P-40 sat in the clearing like a loyal dog waiting for a master who had only gone for a short walk. As the team looked around the immediate area, they realized there were no animal tracks. No birds were singing in the trees directly above the wings. The jungle was loud 100 yards away, but here, in the shadow of the Warhawk, the world was as silent as a grave. When Miller's team finally retreated from the clearing to the nearest village, a small settlement of the Huli people tucked into a valley 5 miles downstream, they expected shock. Instead, they met a heavy, knowing silence. The village elder, a man whose skin was mapped with the tattoos of a century of jungle life, didn't need to see the photos Miller had snapped with his Kodak Instamatic. He simply pointed toward the mist-shrouded peaks of the Owen Stanley Range and whispered a single name in the local dialect, the Silver Spirit. For over 30 years, the villagers had told stories of the ghost bird that lived in the high canopy. It wasn't a legend of a crash, but a legend of a neighbor. According to the oral history of the valley, the plane hadn't arrived in a ball of fire in 1944. It had appeared quietly, drifting over the ridges with its engine humming like a giant cicada, landing in the place where the sun stands still, a clearing that the local hunters avoided because the shadows there never moved. The pilot, the elder explained through a translator, is not a ghost. He is a man caught in the breath of the mountain. The hunters claimed to have seen him. They described a man in a skin of tan cloth, a flight suit, who sat on the wing of the metal bird at sunset, looking out toward the sea. He didn't age. The man they saw in 1950 looked exactly like the man they saw in 1965. He never approached the village, and he never asked for food. He simply sat, sometimes polishing the glass of the cockpit with a white rag, sometimes sipping from a silver cup. One hunter recounted a chilling encounter from the early 1970s. He had tracked a tree kangaroo near the clearing and found the pilot standing by a stream. The pilot had looked at him, not with fear, but with a profound, weary confusion. He had asked a question in a language the hunter didn't know, holding out a small, shiny object, a compass. When the hunter tried to step into the clearing to help him, he felt a thickness in the air, a pressure in his ears so intense it forced him to his knees. By the time the pressure faded, the man was gone, back into the silver bird. To the surveyors, these were the superstitions of an isolated culture. But as they looked at the photos of the pristine cockpit, the unwithered photograph of Evelyn, and the thermos of hot coffee, the ghost bird stories began to feel less like folklore and more like eyewitness testimony. The village elder insisted that the clearing was a leak in the world, a place where the spirits of the sky became trapped in the wood. The most haunting detail of the legend? The villagers claimed the engine would occasionally roar to life in the middle of the night, not to fly, but as if the pilot was simply testing the machine, keeping it ready for a journey back to a home that had long since forgotten him. When Miller's team returned to civilization and presented their findings, the photographs, the logbook entries, and the surreal report of the liquid coffee, the aviation world reacted with a mix of fascination and aggressive skepticism. Experts from the Royal Australian Air Force and historians from the Smithsonian were dispatched to analyze the Ghost P-40. They sought a rational framework for a mystery that seemed to defy the linear progression of time. The first theory was the most obvious: the hoax. Critics argued that a prankster with deep pockets and a morbid sense of humor had airlifted a restored P-40 into the jungle using a heavy-lift helicopter in the mid-1970s. They suggested the 1952 logbook was a forgery, planted to create a modern legend. However, this theory quickly fell apart. The Owen Stanley Range is a nightmare of microclimates and vertical terrain. Flying a heavy-lift chopper into that specific, unmapped valley would have been a logistical feat noticed by every radar station in the Pacific. Furthermore, forensic analysis of the logbook paper showed a chemical aging process consistent with the 1940s, not a modern reproduction. Then came the survivor theory. Could Lieutenant Graves have survived the initial 1944 crash, lived among a lost tribe, and kept his aircraft as a makeshift shelter? Proponents of this idea suggested that Graves might have suffered a mental break, losing track of time and meticulously logging his days based on a broken internal clock. Perhaps 1952 was simply his own confused estimation of the year. But this didn't explain the coffee. Even the most resourceful survivalist cannot brew fresh, hot coffee in a jungle with no bean supply and no heat source for 30 years. A more haunting possibility emerged from atmospheric science. Some researchers pointed to the microclimate preservation effect. They theorized that a rare combination of high-altitude ozone, specific volcanic minerals in the soil, and a permanent envelope of stagnant, low-pressure air had created a natural vacuum seal around the clearing. This could, in theory, slow the oxidation of metal and the decay of organic matter. But while this might explain a preserved photograph, it couldn't explain a mechanical clock that was only 4 minutes off or a thermos that remained pressurized. The final, and perhaps most disturbing, rational explanation was the swap. Historical records showed that a P-40 with Graves serial number had been reported as scrapped in a different theater entirely. Was it possible that another pilot, using a stolen or salvaged aircraft, had been operating a private smuggling route in the post-war years, eventually meeting his end in the Papua New Guinea highlands? Yet, none of these explanations accounted for the villagers' testimony of the man who never aged. As the investigators poked and prodded at the fuselage, they found that the more they looked for a how, the less they understood the who. The P-40 sat there, a silent witness to a set of facts that refused to align with the world outside the clearing. In the end, the mystery of the ghost P-40 was never solved. It was simply surrendered. When a second expedition attempted to return to the clearing in 1980 with heavy recovery equipment and a team of forensic pathologists, they found the valley transformed. A massive, unrecorded landslide had triggered a tectonic shift in the Owen Stanley Range, burying the entire sector under millions of tons of limestone and primeval mud. The place where the sun stands still was gone, entombed forever beneath the earth. Today, Lieutenant William Graves P-40 is referred to as the Mary Celeste of the skies. Like the famous ghost ship found drifting in the Atlantic with its cargo intact and its crew missing, the aircraft remains a puncture wound in the fabric of rational history. It sits in a category of aviation anomalies that science can describe, but never fully explain. The true haunting of the P-40 isn't just the 1952 logbook or the hot coffee, it's the psychological gap it leaves behind. Aviation is a world governed by rigid physics, synchronized clocks, and the absolute laws of fuel and gravity. We want to believe that every crash has a cause and every pilot has a final destination. But the Pacific jungle, with its vast, unmapped green cathedrals, seems to operate on a different set of rules. Some modern theorists suggest the time-slip hypothesis, the idea that certain electromagnetic anomalies in high-altitude tropical ranges can create a localized loop. To Lieutenant Graves, perhaps only 5 minutes had passed between 1944 and 1952. Perhaps to him, the world hadn't changed at all. He was simply waiting for the fog to clear so he could fly home to an Ohio that no longer existed. Others see it as a living memorial. The P-40 didn't rot because it was sustained by the sheer willpower of a man who refused to let his mission end. It was a machine kept alive by a pilot who had become a permanent part of the landscape, a ghost in the most literal sense, a memory that refused to fade into the gray of history. As the years pass, the story has shifted from a military recovery mission into a modern myth. It reminds us that despite our satellites and our GPS, there are still dead zones on this planet. Places where the past doesn't just haunt the present, but actively lives within it. The silver thermos, the unwithered photo of Evelyn, and the shark-toothed fighter remain buried in the dark earth of Papua New Guinea, waiting for a future that may never find them. The Buster Alert was a story of a dog that could see the invisible. The Ferry Command was a story of a woman who was invisible to history. But the P-40 is the story of a man who stepped out of history entirely, leaving behind a cup of hot coffee as the ultimate defiance against the passage of time.